The uniform still smelled like the tarmac in Bagram. I hadn't planned to wear it to Thanksgiving, but something told me to leave it on rather than change at the gas station like I usually did. I walked through my parents' front door, and before I even set down my bag, my brother-in-law's laugh cut through the noise of the kitchen. Wow, that thing looks like it walked out of a museum. What he didn't know was that in less than an hour, one quiet question from me would strip him of every ounce of the confidence he was about to spend the rest of the night performing. My name is Angela Murphy. I'm 43, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and I've spent most of my career in counterintelligence working inside programs, so compartmentalized that even my own mother doesn't know what I actually do for a living. She thinks I handle paperwork. My father thinks I do something with computers. That's fine by me. Some jobs you don't explain, not because you're hiding something shameful, but because the explaining itself is the security risk. I'd driven 4 hours that morning alone, coffee going cold in the cup holder, watching the interstate turn from concrete to farmland to the familiar curve of my parents' street in Ohio. I hadn't slept much. I'd landed from a rotation 11 days earlier and hadn't fully shaken the time change. My uniform, the OCP's I'd had tailored years ago, faded now at the knees and forearms from years of fieldwork sun sweat. Dust that never quite washed out was the only thing I hadn't had time to change out of before I hit the road. I told myself nobody would care. I told myself wrong. David Collins. My sister Emily's husband was already holding court in the living room when I walked in, a glass of bourbon in one hand, his other hand gesturing toward the football game like he owned the network. David is 46, built like a man who spends more time in a gym than he probably should for someone who calls himself a security professional, and he spent the better part of a decade telling anyone who'll listen that he is, in his words, the last line of defense for one of the country's largest defense contractors. He's the director of security there. He has a top-secret SCI clearance, and if you spend more than 10 minutes in a room with him, you will know it because he will find a way to mention it. The moment he saw me in uniform, his face lit up in the particular way it does when he's found something to perform for an audience. Wow, that thing looks like it walked out of a museum. The room laughed. My uncle, my cousin's husband, even Emily gave a small, tired smile, the kind she'd perfected over years of smoothing things over for him. I set my bag down by the stairs and let it go. I've had worse said to me by people who mattered a great deal more. David wasn't finished. He rarely is. He leaned back into the couch cushions and told the room without anyone asking that people who work behind a desk in the private sector, people like him, carry more real weight than most of the men and women who wear the uniform. "No offense, Angela," he said, in the tone of a man who means every ounce of offense, "but a lot of what you all do is just logistics. Real intelligence work happens in rooms you'll never get invited into." Then came the clearance talk. Top secret. Pentagon meetings. Programs so sensitive, he said that 99% of the country wouldn't even be allowed to know they exist. He said it with his chest out, glancing around to see who was watching. I have sat across tables from men who actually carried the kind of clearance David was describing, and not one of them talked about it the way he did. The ones who carry real weight don't need anyone to know they're carrying it. I let him talk. I always let people talk. It's not weakness, it's information. Every sentence someone volunteers when they think you're harmless is a sentence you didn't have to work for. It was somewhere around his third refill that he said the thing that finally made the room go quiet in the wrong direction. He looked at my uniform, then at me, and said almost gently, like he was doing me a favor by saying it out loud, "Honestly, Angela, I doubt someone like you has ever actually seen anything that mattered." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my military ID and set it on the table between the mashed potatoes and the gravy boat, face up, calm as anything. Then I looked at him and asked one question. "David, who sponsors your clearance?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The room went silent in a way Thanksgiving dinners rarely do. Forks stopped. My mother's eyes moved between us. David's jaw worked like he was trying to find the sentence that would save him, and for the first time all evening he couldn't find a single word. Nobody at the table said anything for a long moment. My mother reached for the cranberry sauce that didn't need passing just to have something to do with her hands. My father cleared his throat and asked if anyone wanted more turkey in the too bright voice he uses when he's trying to steer a room back onto solid ground. Emily wouldn't look at either of us. And David picked his glass back up, took a slow sip and forced a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "That's cute," he said, setting the glass down harder than he needed to. "Trying to turn the tables. I get it. It's a lot standing next to someone with my level of access." He said, "my level of access," the way other men say their alma mater. I slid my ID back into my pocket and didn't answer. I've learned that silence unsettles people like David far more than an argument ever could. An argument gives them something to push against. Silence gives them nothing but the sound of their own voice. And eventually they start to hear it. He didn't let it go, of course. Within a few minutes he was back at it louder now, like he needed to recover the ground he felt he'd lost. He talked about the contracts his company held numbers with more zeros than any reasonable person needed to mention at a dinner table, and how he'd shaken hands with two-star generals who treated him like family. He mentioned casually that he'd walked through restricted areas at a facility most people couldn't find on a map. He said the name of the facility, then he said the name of the program tied to it, waving it off like it was nothing, like the words themselves didn't matter, as long as his tone stayed light. I felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with hurt feelings. It wasn't embarrassment on his behalf either. It was recognition, the specific cold recognition that comes from doing this job for as long as I have. I've sat in briefings where analysts flagged behavior exactly like this. Not because someone meant harm, because they didn't understand what they were doing at all. He wasn't finished making his case. He turned to me directly this time, chewing over a bite of stuffing, and asked what unit I was actually assigned to, what my day-to-day looked like, where I'd been the last few months. He asked it casually, the way you'd ask someone about their commute, but there was an edge underneath it, a need to prove that whatever I did couldn't possibly measure up to whatever he imagined he did. "I'm not able to discuss that," I told him, keeping my voice even. He smiled at that, the kind of smile that thinks it's won something. "Or maybe there's nothing to discuss." A couple of people at the table laughed, more out of relief than agreement, glad to have something to release the tension into. My cousin's husband shot me a sympathetic look. Emily still hadn't spoken. I caught my mother's eye for half a second, and she gave me the smallest shake of her head, not disapproval, just an old tired plea for peace at her table. I understood. I've spent every holiday for the last 15 years understanding, so I let him have his moment. I nodded, took a bite of green beans, and let the conversation move past me toward the football score and my uncle's opinion on the referees. From the outside, I imagine it looked like David had won. He certainly seemed to think so. I watched him lean back, satisfied, refilling his glass again, glancing toward Emily like he expected her to be proud of him. But I wasn't listening to the football anymore. I was listening to him. Because underneath all the bravado, David had just done something in the space of 20 minutes that would have earned a serious conversation with a security officer in any professional setting I've ever worked in. He'd named a facility. He'd named a program associated with it. He'd referenced a meeting schedule involving general officers complete with rough dates. He'd mentioned offhand a client relationship tied to a contract vehicle that, if I was remembering the acronym correctly, and I usually am sat in a category most people in his position aren't supposed to discuss outside of a secure room, let alone a dinner table with a UFC fight muted on the TV behind him. None of it on its own was catastrophic. That's the thing people never understand about this kind of exposure. It's rarely one dramatic leak. It's a pattern, small, careless threads pulled loose one at a time by a person who feels invincible because nothing bad has happened yet. David wasn't trying to hurt anyone. He was trying to impress a room full of relatives on a holiday, the same as he probably did at every dinner party, every client happy hour, every golf outing where he wanted to feel important. He had simply never been told clearly and seriously that the currency he was spending wasn't his to spend. I didn't say any of this out loud. I didn't lecture him, didn't pull him aside, didn't do anything that would have turned Thanksgiving into an interrogation. That's not how this works, and frankly, it's not who I am. I finished my plate. I complimented my mother's pie. I let David have his victory lap around the living room for the rest of the night, holding his glass like a trophy, still glancing at me now and then, to see if I'd shrunk the way he wanted me to. I hadn't. I'd just started paying closer attention. By the time I helped clear the dishes, I'd already noted, without meaning to 3 separate details, David had volunteered that a trained ear could piece together into something far more useful than he understood. I told myself it didn't matter. It was Thanksgiving. He was drunk on bourbon and self-importance, nothing more. I was wrong about that too, though it would be another week before I found out how wrong. I didn't bring any of it up again that night. I helped my mother wrap the leftovers, listened to my father debate my uncle about the game, and let the evening wind down the way Thanksgivings usually do. Slow, a little too warm from the oven still running, everyone drifting toward the couches with second slices of pie they didn't need. David held on to his good mood the rest of the night, refilling his glass twice more, telling the story of some negotiation he'd supposedly closed single-handedly, embellishing it a little more each time he repeated it. Nobody corrected him. Nobody ever does. But I kept turning the evening over in my head anyway, the way I do with everything professionally and otherwise. It's not something I can switch off. 15 years in counterintelligence rewires the way you listen to people. You stop hearing conversations as conversations and start hearing them as patterns, what's said, what's implied, what's revealed, without anyone meaning to reveal it. And David, over the course of one dinner, had revealed more than he realized. It wasn't any single sentence. If it had been one comment, one slip, I'd have written it off exactly the way I told myself to at the table, a man who'd had too much bourbon and wanted to feel important in front of his wife's family. But it wasn't one comment. It was a pattern, and patterns are the thing I've spent my career trained to notice the same way a cardiologist can't help but hear an irregular rhythm, even at a dinner party. He'd named the facility outright not once but twice, correcting himself the second time to a more specific building designation, as though precision made him sound more credible. He'd mentioned a program tied to that facility by an acronym that most people wouldn't recognize, but I did because it had crossed my desk before in a very different context. He'd referenced a client meeting scheduled for early December, complete with the city it would be held in, and casually mentioned which general officers were expected to attend. On their own fragments. Together, something else entirely, the outline of information that should never leave a secure conversation laid out over turkey and mashed potatoes, because a man wanted his wife's family to think he mattered. The unsettling part wasn't that David was malicious. He wasn't. If anything, that's what made it more dangerous. Malicious people are careful because they know what they're doing is wrong. Careless people are the ones who cause real damage because they genuinely believe they're just making conversation. David had convinced himself somewhere along the way that his clearance was a trophy to be displayed, rather than a responsibility to be carried quietly. Nobody had ever told him otherwise. Or if they had, he hadn't been listening. I thought about saying something to him directly. I actually considered it standing at the sink that night with a dish towel in my hand, watching him through the kitchen doorway as he showed my cousin something on his phone, gesturing too big, laughing too loud. I could have pulled him aside. I could have told him quietly, colleague to colleague, that the things he'd said tonight weren't the kind of things you say at a dinner table. That precision and specificity are exactly what make casual conversation dangerous in his line of work. Somewhere the words even started to form. But I didn't say them. Partly because I know men like David well enough to know it wouldn't have landed the way I intended. He would have heard it as another attempt by me to one-up him another performance in the ongoing contest he seemed to think we were having. And partly because it wasn't my place. I wasn't his security officer. I wasn't his supervisor. I was his sister-in-law standing in her parents' kitchen on a holiday watching a man dig a hole he didn't know he was digging. So instead I asked a few questions. Nothing that would have raised suspicion. I've spent my career learning how to ask questions that don't feel like questions. I asked how the December meeting was shaping up, whether the client was difficult to work with, whether he was looking forward to the travel. Ordinary things. Small talk on the surface. But David, riding the high of an audience, answered every single one of them a little too fully. He told me which base the meeting would take place near. He mentioned without prompting that the client had specifically requested a briefing on a subsystem I recognized by description, even though he never used its formal name. He told me the names of 2 people who'd be flying in for it, one of whom I'd crossed paths with years earlier in a completely different context. I didn't write any of it down. I didn't need to. That's not how the job works. Not really. It's not about capturing every detail in the moment. It's about noticing when someone's pattern of disclosure crosses a line that shouldn't be crossable, and remembering it well enough to recognize if it happens again. And somewhere around the 4th or 5th answer, standing there with a dish towel over my shoulder, I understood that this wasn't an isolated evening for David. This was simply how he operated. This was a man who talked like this constantly, probably at every dinner, every golf outing, every client happy hour, comfortable in the assumption that his position made him untouchable rather than accountable. Emily came into the kitchen not long after, tired in that specific way that comes from managing someone else's ego all day, and asked if I needed help drying anything. I told her I was fine. She lingered a moment, glancing toward the living room, where David's voice still carried, and said quietly, almost apologetic, "He gets like this around family. He doesn't mean anything by it." I told her I knew. I meant it too. David didn't mean anything by it. That was exactly the problem. I drove home the next morning before anyone else was up. The uniform folded on the passenger seat, my mind already elsewhere. Not on David specifically, not yet, but on the quiet professional unease that had settled into the back of my thoughts and hadn't left since dinner. I told myself the way I always do that it wasn't mine to carry, that whatever happened next wasn't something I needed to set in motion. I was right about that in the end. I never had to. I want to pause the story here for a second and tell you a little about what I actually do, because it matters for what comes next. And because for years I let my own family believe something much smaller and much safer than the truth. My mother thinks I handle paperwork for the army. My father, a little closer, thinks I do something with computers. Neither of them is wrong exactly in the way that neither of them is right. I'm a lieutenant colonel in Army counterintelligence, and for the better part of my career I've worked inside programs designed to protect the country's most sensitive defense information, not from foreign spies in trench coats, which is what people imagine when they hear the word, but from something far more common and far more dangerous: carelessness. Insider risk. The slow leak of information from people who never intended to leak anything at all. My job, stripped down to its simplest form, is to notice patterns other people miss. I evaluate risk before it becomes damage. I look at behavior: who's talking too much, who's asking questions they shouldn't be asking, who's treating classified access like a personal accomplishment instead of a professional obligation. And I assess whether that behavior represents a genuine threat to national security, or just an ordinary human being who's lost sight of the weight of what they're carrying. Most of the time it's the second one. People aren't traitors. They're tired or proud or lonely or drunk on their own importance, and they say things they shouldn't because saying things feels like being someone. I've kept this from my family for years, not because I'm ashamed of it, but because explaining it invites questions I'm not allowed to answer, and half answers only breed more curiosity. It was easier over the holidays, over birthdays, over every ordinary family dinner to let them believe I filed reports and pushed papers in some windowless office at Fort Meade. It kept things simple. It kept the dinner table light. And frankly, it kept me safe from exactly the kind of conversation David loved, having the kind where rank and title get measured out loud like currency. David didn't know any of this, obviously. To him, I was just his wife's sister who wore a uniform that had seen better days and never talked about her job, which in his mind meant there wasn't much of a job to talk about. It never occurred to him that the reason I didn't talk about my work wasn't that it was small. It was the opposite. After that Thanksgiving, David didn't let the subject drop, not really. Over the following weeks, whenever our families crossed paths, a phone call with Emily, that he'd insert himself into a photo he'd tag me in online, with some comment about real access. He kept finding small ways to remind everyone, and maybe himself, that he was the one who mattered in rooms most people never got invited into. It became something of a running theme with him, a joke that wasn't really a joke. "I'm sure Angela's got some real secrets," he said once at Emily's birthday dinner in early December, loud enough for the table to hear. "Filing cabinets full of them." He laughed at his own line. Nobody else did, not quite. I let it go the same way I always did, I told myself the same way I always did that it wasn't my responsibility to correct him, that his ego was between him and whoever eventually had the patience to manage it, and that patience clearly wasn't going to be me. I had actual work waiting for me back at the office, an ongoing assessment involving a defense contractor's employee whose spending patterns had triggered a flag unrelated entirely to my own family. The kind of case that took up real hours and real attention. David's dinner table bravado wasn't on my radar in any professional sense. It was just background noise, the kind every family has. The uncle who talks too much about his portfolio, the cousin who over-explains her diet. But somewhere underneath that, quietly, a part of me that never fully turns off kept a small, unspoken account of what he'd said. Not because I was building a case against him, I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as though I'd been lying in wait watching for my moment. I wasn't. I had genuinely hoped none of it would ever matter again, that David would go on being David, mildly insufferable and entirely harmless, and that the worst outcome of any of this would be another decade of holiday dinners, where he reminded everyone of his clearance level like it was a family heirloom. That's the thing about this job that people outside of it rarely understand. You don't go looking for problems. Problems find you slowly through their own momentum, built entirely by the people who create them. I never once considered reporting David for what he'd said at Thanksgiving. It didn't rise to that level, not from what I'd personally witnessed. Careless talk at a family dinner, however uncomfortable, wasn't evidence of anything beyond poor judgment, and poor judgment isn't a crime. I genuinely believed, driving home from Emily's birthday dinner that December night, that the matter had ended exactly where it should have, with me mildly irritated saying nothing, and David blissfully unaware moving on to whatever he'd brag about next. I was wrong. Not because I'd misjudged David's character, I hadn't, but because I'd underestimated how far a man like that would take it once he thought no one who mattered was listening. It would be another week before I found out he'd done exactly that at a room full of people who very much mattered, and that this time someone had been recording. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, though I didn't know at the time it had anything to do with David at all. I was at my desk finishing a routine review when my supervisor, Colonel Whitfield, stopped by my office door with the particular expression he wears when something's landed on his desk that he'd rather not deal with. "You know a David Collins?" he asked. My stomach dropped before my brain caught up to why. As it turned out, David had spent the better part of the previous week doing exactly what he'd done at our family's dinner table. Except this time, the audience was a room full of prospective clients and subcontractors at an industry conference 2 states away, the kind of event where defense contractors mingle trade business cards and try to impress each other over hotel bar drinks. According to what eventually made its way into the record, David had spent a good portion of one evening doing precisely what he does best, talking about himself, his access, and the sensitivity of the work his company handled, growing louder and more specific with every round of drinks. What David didn't know, what none of the people in that room fully understood at the time, was that industry events like that one are exactly the kind of environment where people pay closer attention than you'd expect. Someone in that room, a compliance officer from a competing firm, had grown uneasy enough with what David was saying that they'd quietly recorded a portion of the conversation on their phone. Initially just to have a record in case they needed to raise concerns with their own leadership. Instead, that recording ended up getting forwarded through channels I still don't fully understand, and frankly didn't need to, into an internal review process at David's own company, which eventually triggered a broader security assessment. That assessment landed through the normal chain of referrals between defense contractors and the Department of Defense on a desk not far from mine. I want to be clear about something because it's the part of this story people are always most eager to get wrong. I did not report David. I had no evidence, no recording, nothing beyond a mildly uncomfortable Thanksgiving dinner and a birthday party joke that never rose to the level of anything actionable. I hadn't filed so much as a note about him. The investigation that eventually reached my unit began entirely independent of me, triggered by people who had never met me and had no idea David had a sister-in-law who did this kind of work for a living. But the moment his name crossed my desk as part of a case file assignment, I recognized it immediately, and I did the only thing my training and my conscience would allow. I walked straight into Colonel Whitfield's office and disclosed the conflict of interest before anyone even asked. "This is my sister's husband," I told him. "I need to be recused from any part of this." He didn't hesitate. Cases like this move faster and cleaner when personal entanglements are removed before they become a problem, and Whitfield has never once doubted my judgment in 15 years of working together. Within the hour, my name was pulled from the file, and a separate team people I didn't know working entirely outside my chain took over the assessment. From that point forward, I knew almost nothing. That's how it's supposed to work, and frankly, it's how I wanted it to work. I didn't ask questions, I didn't check in. I went back to my own caseload and did my job the same as I always had, while somewhere else in the building people I'd never meet quietly built a picture of exactly how much David had said to how many people over how long a period of time. I won't pretend the next few weeks were easy. There's a specific kind of discomfort that comes from knowing something is unfolding around someone you care about, or at least someone your sister loves, and having absolutely no ability to influence it, warn him, or even hint that anything was happening. Emily called me twice that month once, about nothing in particular. Once to vent about David working late more than usual, distracted, short-tempered in a way she couldn't explain. I listened both times. I said nothing about what I suspected was coming. It wasn't my place, and more than that, it wasn't my information to share. I'd spent my entire career learning the discipline of silence, and this was the hardest test of it I'd faced in years, precisely because the person on the other end of the phone was someone I loved. There were nights I lay awake turning it over, not guilt, exactly because I hadn't done anything to set this in motion, but something adjacent to it. A kind of grief for what was coming for Emily, for my parents, for the version of this family that existed before any of us knew what David had been doing, behind the confidence he wore like armor. I thought about the Thanksgiving table, the ID card sitting between the mashed potatoes and the gravy, the question I'd asked him. I thought about how small that moment had seemed at the time, and how it now felt like the first thread in something much larger, something I hadn't pulled and couldn't stop. I didn't have to wait much longer to find out how it ended. The call came from Emily herself on a Thursday evening in January, her voice shaking in a way I'd never heard from her before. "Angela," she said, "David's clearance got pulled. They're putting him on leave. I don't understand what's happening." I sat down slowly on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, and for the first time in weeks I let myself feel the full weight of what I'd known was coming. The full picture came out slowly, the way these things usually do, in pieces that reached our family through Emily, who was herself only getting fragments from David's lawyer, and from a company that had gone suddenly coldly formal, with a man they'd spent a decade calling their most trusted director. What I already suspected turned out to be close to accurate, though the scope of it was worse than I'd imagined sitting in my own office that Tuesday. The investigation found a pattern stretching back well over a year, not one reckless evening at a hotel bar, but a habit. David had on multiple documented occasions disclosed information well beyond what any conversation required, program names to people with no need to know them, facility details to clients who hadn't been read into the relevant contract, scheduling and personnel information that should never have left a secure setting. None of it, as far as the investigators could determine, had been sold, traded, or handed to anyone with hostile intent. That mattered, and it kept the outcome from being catastrophic in the way these stories sometimes are. But it didn't matter nearly as much as David seemed to think it should, because the rules he'd been trusted to follow were never about intent. They were about discipline, the simple, unglamorous discipline of not saying things you're not supposed to say, regardless of how safe the room feels, or how impressive you want to sound. David had spent years treating his clearance like proof of his own importance, a badge to be worn loudly rather than a responsibility to be carried quietly, and the investigation didn't care that he meant no harm. It only cared that harm had repeatedly been possible. His clearance was suspended pending a full review, which effectively ended his ability to do the job he'd built his entire identity around. The contractor, facing its own scrutiny from the government agencies it depended on for its livelihood, moved fast to distance itself from him, first placing him on administrative leave, then, within a matter of weeks, terminating his position entirely. A man who had spent a decade telling anyone who'd listen about his access to rooms most people never got invited into found himself almost overnight locked out of every one of them. Emily was the one who carried most of the weight of it in those early weeks. She'd married a man whose confidence had always felt to her like strength, steady, capable, someone who knew things and handled things and never seemed rattled by anything. Watching that same confidence collapse into confusion and then anger, and then a kind of quiet, humiliated silence was, she told me later, one of the hardest things she'd ever gone through. He didn't understand what he'd done wrong. Not really. Not at first. He kept saying the same thing over and over to Emily, to his lawyer, to anyone who'd listen, that he'd never told anyone anything that mattered, that he'd just been talking, that surely people talked like this all the time. He wasn't entirely wrong about that last part, and that's the uncomfortable truth underneath this whole story. People do talk like that all the time. Most of them get away with it because most of the time nobody happens to be listening closely enough or recording or positioned to connect the fragments into something meaningful. David wasn't unlucky because he said something uniquely damaging. He was unlucky because eventually, in a room full of the wrong people, his luck ran out. The rules had always applied to him. He'd simply never been made to feel their weight before. My parents found out everything roughly the same time I did through a long, difficult phone call from Emily that my mother later described to me in a voice still tight with disbelief. They hadn't seen it coming. How could they? To them, David had always been the confident one, the successful one, the son-in-law who talked over dinner about important things, while their own daughter sat quietly in a faded uniform saying almost nothing at all. It took them time to fully absorb what had actually happened, and longer still to understand what it meant that I had known for weeks and said nothing. My mother asked me about it directly not long after the news broke fully within the family. "Did you know this was coming?" she asked me gently, not accusing, just trying to understand. I told her the truth, that I'd suspected something wasn't right after Thanksgiving, that I'd been recused the moment David's name crossed a file on my desk, and that beyond that I genuinely hadn't known any of the details until Emily called. I told her I couldn't have said anything even if I had known more, and she nodded slowly, the way people do when they're absorbing something that reorganizes everything they thought they understood about a person. It was Emily in the end who put it together first in a conversation with our mother that eventually made its way back to me. She remembered Thanksgiving, the ID on the table, the single question I'd asked, the way David had gone silent for the first time all evening. She realized, piecing it together months later, that I had recognized something that night that none of the rest of them had. Not the specifics, not the scope, but the shape of it, the pattern of a man who didn't understand what he was carrying. She wasn't trying to embarrass him. Emily told our mother, according to what she later repeated to me almost word for word. She was trying to warn him, he just wasn't listening. My father, when he finally spoke to me about it directly, didn't say much. He's never been a man of many words, especially about things that unsettle him. But he looked at me for a long moment across the kitchen table, the same table where David had laughed at my uniform 2 months earlier, and he said only this: "I think we've been underestimating you for a long time, Angela." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. I just nodded and let the silence sit there, the way I've learned silence often needs to. David reached out to me himself about 3 weeks after everything came apart, which surprised me more than I expected it to. He'd never called me directly before. In all the years he'd been married to my sister, every interaction we'd ever had ran through Emily, through family dinners, through the safe mediated distance of in-laws who tolerate each other for someone else's sake. So when my phone rang and his name showed up on the screen, I sat with it for a moment before answering, unsure what version of him I was about to hear. It wasn't the version I expected. Gone was the performance, the volume, the need to fill every silence with a reminder of how important he was. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, almost hesitant, a man picking his way carefully through unfamiliar territory. He asked if we could meet in person, just the two of us, no Emily, no family dinner as a buffer. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, and partly because some part of me understood that this conversation, whatever it turned out to be, needed to happen without an audience, which for a man like David was its own kind of significant. We met at a coffee shop near my parents' town, a place I'd never been to before, and haven't been to since, the kind of neutral ground people choose when they need somewhere that doesn't belong to either of them. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth, and I almost didn't recognize him at first, not physically but in the way he held himself. smaller, quieter. A man who'd had something essential to his identity stripped away and hadn't yet figured out what to build in its place. He didn't waste time on small talk, that at least hadn't changed. "I keep going over it," he said, turning his cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. Trying to figure out exactly which conversation did it, which sentence. I can't even remember most of what I said at that conference. I was just talking. He looked up at me then, and for the first time since I'd known him, there was nothing performed in his expression at all. Was it Thanksgiving? Did I say something at Thanksgiving that started this? I told him the truth because he deserved that much, and because lying to him at that point would have served no one. "No," I said. What happened had nothing to do with Thanksgiving. That started somewhere else entirely, with people I've never met in a room I wasn't in. I watched something in his shoulders ease slightly at that, some fear he'd apparently been carrying that I had somehow set this in motion myself. "But David," I added, I want to be honest with you about something else. What you were doing at that dinner table, the names, the details, the specifics you kept volunteering, that wasn't new. You'd been doing it for years. I noticed it that night because it's my job to notice it. Whatever happened at that conference wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a habit finally catching up with you." He was quiet for a long moment after that, staring down at his coffee like it might offer him something easier to hear. Then he asked the question I think he'd actually come there to ask, the one underneath all the others. "Why didn't you say something that night, or after you clearly knew? You could have warned me." It was a fair question, and I'd asked it of myself more than once in the weeks since Emily's call. "I thought about it," I told him honestly. "Standing in my parents' kitchen that night, I almost pulled you aside. But David, I've spent my entire career learning that you can't tell someone like you were at that stage anything they're not ready to hear. You'd have taken it as another move in whatever contest you thought we were having. I was your sister-in-law giving you unsolicited advice at a family dinner, not a colleague you respected. It wouldn't have landed, not then." "And now?" he asked quietly. "Now you're actually asking," I said. "That's different." He nodded slowly, and something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of something closer to understanding. "Sarah, the compliance officer who recorded me at the conference," he said. "I met with her after everything. She told me almost the same thing you just did. That it wasn't one conversation. That people who work with real access for long enough develop an instinct for saying less, not more. And that I'd never developed it because nobody had ever made me. I kept thinking she was being cruel. I don't think she was anymore." We sat there for a while after that, not saying much, the coffee going cold between us the way it so often does in conversations that matter more than the setting they happen in. Eventually he asked me the question that I think mattered most to him, the one he'd probably been building toward since he first called. "Why didn't you ever tell any of us what you actually do all these years? And I had no idea. I thought you were exactly what I made you out to be." I thought about how to answer that honestly without turning it into a lesson, because he'd had enough lessons handed to him lately, and I didn't want to be one more person delivering him a lecture over coffee. "Because the people who are actually trusted with real information," I said finally, "don't need anyone else to know it, David. That was never the point. The job was never about being impressive at dinner. It was about being reliable in the rooms nobody sees." He didn't say anything to that for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost whatever was left of the confidence I'd known him by for a decade. "I don't know how to be that," he admitted. "I don't think I ever learned how." "You're learning now?" I told him, and I meant it. It wasn't forgiveness exactly that would come later, slowly, the way it always does in families that choose to keep trying, but it was something. A door left open rather than one closed for good.